All right. Hi, everybody, and thank you for being here. I see we've got 30 or so of you coming into the room and maybe a few more trickling in over the next few minutes. My name is Rachel Skipper. I'll be kind of just moderating today's virtual session. You may have seen me on Zoom before because I'm the Associate Director of Undergraduate and of Graduate Recruitment in the College of Arts and Sciences. But I am not the star of today's show by any means. I'll mostly just be here kind of helping out in the background. We do want to make sure that you're aware this is Professor Thompson, who I know you're all eager to meet and is on camera now to
Oh,
kind of chat with you for a second before we get started. She started teaching at Syracuse in 1981, so she's been at Syracuse for 43 years now. She's a great resource for you, and I'm really excited that you get to learn from her today as part of a virtual classroom. During the time that she's been at Syracuse, she's taught in a bunch of different departments as well. So that includes the Department of History, Political Science, Women's and Gender Studies, Religion, as she's also taught courses for the honors program. So if any of you are interested in honors, you may meet her in that context as well. Currently, she's a professor in the history department, which you may already know is in the Maxwell School. She studies political history, and she focuses on the 19th century in the United States, and particularly the Congress. Her recent work, which I was really interested in reading more about today, focuses on the history of American Catholic nuns, and specifically from a feminist perspective, which is really cool. She teaches classes on a range of subjects, including the ones I mentioned, but I would encourage you to ask her about this yourselves, right? What kind of classes do you teach? What's the nuns thing about, right? I'm sure you all have many interesting questions for her, and there will be time for Q&A today. So I would encourage you to ask us those questions. So some of you will see her on campus one day. You're welcome to ask her questions now or then. But all this is really just to say you're in very good hands today. You should really get the Maxwell experience, I think, and maybe a little bit of the arts and sciences experience today too. So I'll leave it to Professor Thompson to run the class. If you have questions, let me know in the Q&A feature, and I'll be helping moderate Q&A at the end of the presentation.
that's great. And I can see that there are 28 of you on. I cannot see you, and I cannot see myself. So if there are any problems, please write a little message in the chat and Rachel will moderate it. So what I'd like to do to begin with is to give you some background and then we'll open it up for discussion. Okay? So since you're all muted, I can't hear you say yes, but I'm assuming that you're all nodding your heads very wisely. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the modern presidency in general, and then get to the question of how and why it's important to know about this thing about presidents dealing with the unexpected. But first, I'm going to give you a little quiz. And unfortunately, I can't see you. So if you have an answer to the quiz, I want you to put it in the chat. So I'm going to show you the pictures of 3 presidents. And if you can identify who they are, then please put it in the chat. And I'll just give you about 30 seconds because it doesn't really matter if you can't. And I'll tell you a secret. When I do this early in my Modern American Presidency course at SU, there are years when nobody can do it. And there are years when maybe one person can do it. But there's never a time when most people can do it. So anyone want to put an answer in the chat? I'm not seeing a whole lot of action there, and that's all right. So let me just tell you who these guys are.
Oh, you've
Oh,
got Taft, Fillmore, Garfield.
we've got Taft. Taft is not one of them. Amal has Fillmore and Garfield. You got one right. Bobby says Hayes. You got one right, but you're not telling me which one is Hayes and which one is Garfield. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. But my point is, okay, so number 1 is James A. Garfield. Number 2 is Benjamin Harrison. And number 3 is Rutherford B. Hayes. And you may want to know, why the heck is she putting up these guys? They all served about 150 years ago. And the answer is because if I were to put up modern presidents, everybody would get them. But remember, in the 19th century, nobody really ever saw the president, except for a very small number of people. And a lot of people didn't even know what presidents looked like. So it's a very different world when we talk about the 19th century and when we talk about the 21st century, and this transition that happened sometime in the 20th century. So don't assume the presidency has always been the way it is now, that the president's the most famous person and the most visible person in the world. It simply isn't the case. So I just want to give you a little mnemonic for characterizing the modern presidency. And you may want to take this down, you may not. You take my class, and if you've got AP credit or some kind of credit in either US history or political science, you can take my class in the fall, but I teach it every fall. And here are 9 attributes of the modern presidency. And they begin with the letters PPP, SSS, CCC, which makes it easier to identify and remember. Politics, process, policy. Those are the P's. Style or symbol. The president is a symbol of the country in many ways. Structure. What's the structure of the modern presidency? What's the substance? What is it that the presidency is all about? What does it consist of? Character. There's a famous book about the presidency and a PBS series a few years ago called Character Above All. Charisma. Most modern presidents have charisma. In the 19th century, it didn't matter whether, I have no idea if Benjamin Harrison had charisma. And it didn't really matter because you couldn't hear his voice and most people couldn't see it. And the final one is competence. And I'm going to be talking a lot about that this evening. So those are some of the characteristics that we think of when we think of the modern presidency. A scholar named Michael Nelson talks about 3 types of modern presidents. And I'll tell you, a lot of my students get really excited when they learn about these, and maybe too excited, and talk about that a lot. So it's not the only thing that you need to know about the modern presidency, but it's kind of a helpful model. He talks about the so-called savior presidents. First one was FDR, but also Truman, JFK, and even a reinterpreted Dwight D. Eisenhower. So it's not a party thing. Savior presidents use power aggressively, and they use it for good. And most Americans think they are using it for good. Power is both necessary and admirable in an effective savior presidency. That would not have been true for our friends Garfield and Hayes and Harrison. Then there are the Satan presidents. They also use power aggressively, but not necessarily for good. This is the time when we hear the phrase, the imperial presidency. The presidency as a monarchy, and it's much more critical. Whereas the savior model sees presidents as very positive figures, Satan model not so much. And 2 examples of that would be Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. And of course, Richard Nixon was such a negative figure that he was forced to resign. And again, one of these is a Democrat, one of these is a Republican. So we're not talking about a party thing here. And finally, the Samson presidents, the ones who were kind of impotent. And they followed these 2 Satans. People said, maybe power isn't such a good thing. Maybe we don't want presidents to use power too aggressively. So there's a large gap between what presidents should do and what they can do. And examples of that are Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. And the important thing about all of these types is that in the modern presidency, expectations of power and the use of power are central to all the types, whether it's good, bad, or needs to be controlled. Another scholar of the modern presidency is a man called Fred Greenstein. And he came up with 6 characteristics that contribute to the success of presidents. And that's the difference he's referring to between a successful and an unsuccessful modern president. The ability to communicate effectively. Some presidents are better at this than others. And remember, our friends Garfield, Hayes, and Harrison, they didn't need to know how to communicate effectively because nobody was going to hear them anyway. We don't know what their voices sounded like. We don't know what Lincoln's voice sounded like. We've probably all read or heard about the Gettysburg Address, but we don't know what it sounded like. And only a few hundred people actually heard him deliver that speech. Not true today, when a president can go online and can go on TV and speak to millions of people at one time. President Biden's going to be in Syracuse, New York tomorrow, speaking to a group of citizens in this community. People are going to know what he sounds like because they can hear him. Another characteristic is organizational capacity. How does a president design his administration? What kinds of people does he appoint? Political skill. How does the president form coalitions, build support, and so on? Maybe work bipartisanly. You'll remember President Biden, when he campaigned for president in 2020, said, I'm going to work across the aisle. That's what I did when I was in the Senate. He's had mixed success with that, but that was something he has tried to do. Does a president have vision? Does he have a compelling set of goals? We're going to come back to that in a little while. Cognitive style. How does he understand things? How does he think about things? How does he obtain knowledge? How does he get to know what he needs to know? We're going to talk about that later too. And finally, emotional intelligence. One of the things about both of our friends, Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, the Satan presidents, was that they were considered to have really active inner demons. And we probably don't want a president with a whole lot of inner demons. It's probably not all that healthy. So, for example, people saw Barack Obama as generally a very positive individual, but they also saw Ronald Reagan that way. They saw Franklin Roosevelt that way. Again, it's not a party thing. Another scholar, Bert Rockman, and that's going to be one of the differences when you start taking college classes as opposed to high school classes. We're going to expect you to become familiar with certain scholars on the subjects that you're studying. So you don't need to remember these names now, but down the road, you'll be introduced to various people who have written on these subjects, and you'll be reading what they had to say. And he talks about two types of presidencies as well, a transactional versus a transformative presidency. And a transactional leader is actually descriptive of most presidents. They make bargains, they're willing to deal. Vision is less important than accomplishing things in a kind of instrumental way. Leadership is transactional. I'm going to try to do this. Maybe there are trade-offs and so forth. Sometimes these presidents are criticized for not being too inspirational, but they often get a lot done. The other kind is a transformative president, a president who has a new vision for transforming either government or the nation. We saw that with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. We saw that with Ronald Reagan. We even saw that with John F. Kennedy when he said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. These are presidents with vision. Not all presidents have vision. President George H.W. Bush even kind of dismissed that. And he said, I'm not real good about the vision thing. But he considered himself a more effective transactional president. I can get things done, he said. And when he campaigned for president, he said, I'll be ready to be president on day one. So there are two types of presidential agendas. And this is where we're going to get into the how presidents deal with the unexpected part. The first one is the one you're probably more familiar with, the intentional agenda. Every president who runs for office says, if I'm elected, I intend to do the following thing. Every president has a platform. And so the idea is vote for me because I will do the following things. And on the other hand, if you don't like what they want to do, you might say, maybe I don't want to vote for that candidate. I want to vote for somebody else. I don't like what they intend to do. So I'm going to vote for somebody else. And so when you go to the polls, and many of you will be going to the polls to vote for president for the first time this November, some of you may not even be old enough yet, but most of you will be. And one of the things you're going to ask yourself is, okay, both of these major party candidates and some minor party candidates are telling me what they want to do. So what do I think is a better course for the country to take? That's the candidate I'm going to vote for. And that's important, but it's not the only thing I want you to think about. And here we're getting into what I wanted to talk with you about today. The other type of agenda is the unanticipated agenda. How does a president deal with the unexpected? Whatever your intentions are, if you elect me, I'm going to do the following things. That's great. And then virtually every modern president has been confronted by unexpected crises, unexpected things that they absolutely have to deal with. They couldn't run for office saying, if elected, I will do the following about that, because they didn't know what was going to happen. So let's think about what some of those unanticipated items might be in modern times. Abraham Lincoln wasn't modern, but obviously he had to deal with the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson, when he became president in 1913, he wrote to a very dear friend. He said, I hope there won't be any big foreign policy crises in my presidency because I'm really not prepared to deal with those. Well, guess what? He had to deal with the First World War. Herbert Hoover was elected because he was an engineer, he was a technician, he was a scientist. And less than a year after he became president, we had the stock market crash in the beginning of the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, had to deal with that. It wasn't unexpected, although he wasn't quite sure what he's going to do about it. But he had World War II. When he was elected in 1932, there was no sense that he was going to have to deal with a major world war. Harry Truman, just a couple of months after he became president, had to deal with the atomic bomb. He didn't really know much about it, but he had to make the decision as to whether or not to use it. And then, of course, he had to deal with the Korean War later on, as well as the entirety of the Cold War. John F. Kennedy, a couple of months after he was elected, the Bay of Pigs, he had to deal with the construction of the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Lyndon Johnson, who of course didn't know that he was going to become president in 1963 because he was vice president, but he had to deal with the Tonkin Gulf and the Vietnam War, although his main objective as president was to be a domestic one: civil rights, the Great Society, the war on poverty. Lyndon Johnson, by the way, announced the Tonkin Gulf incident at Syracuse University. He was on campus to dedicate the Newhouse School in 1964 in August, and that was the first public statement he made about the Tonkin Gulf. Richard Nixon, of course, had Watergate. Gerald Ford, again, the presidency itself. When Richard Nixon was reelected in 1972, Gerald Ford was the minority leader of the House of Representatives. And less than 2 years later, he would be president. Jimmy Carter had the Iranian hostage crisis a year before the 1980 election. Ronald Reagan, a couple of months after he was elected, an assassination attempt, and then later the Iran-Contra crisis. George H.W. Bush, he said he was ready on day one, but he was ready to be a Cold War president. He had to deal with the fact that the world was no longer involved in the Cold War. And then, of course, he had to deal with the first Gulf War. Bill Clinton, the GOP contract with America, and then, of course, his own impeachment. George W. Bush, September 11th, obviously something he was not anticipating. Barack Obama, the 2008 economic crisis, happened before he was elected, but not before he decided to run. And Donald Trump didn't expect to get elected at all. And so just dealing with the presidency itself was somewhat unexpected for him. And we've heard that from people who worked with him in 2016, that he was kind of surprised. Oh my goodness, now I actually have to do this. Joe Biden, crises in Ukraine, and then the whole situation, Israel and Gaza, that we're dealing with right now. So this idea of these two agendas, actually, I got from reading this book by James Carville and Paul Begala, who worked for President Clinton. And they talk about the fact that when we try to vote for a president, we shouldn't just think about what they say they want to do, but we should also think about how we think they will deal with what they can't possibly anticipate. And so he says they say the best presidents are master improvisers, leaders flexible enough to change with circumstances. And so one of the things we have to think about as voters is not just what do these people say they want to do if they're elected, but how well do we think they would work if a crisis comes along? With Donald Trump, obviously the presidency was unexpected, but let's think about the COVID crisis, for example. Nobody could have anticipated that. Nobody. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we elect somebody not knowing what they're going to have to face, but what skills do they have, going back to some of those earlier points I raised, that might help them, make them effective in dealing with the unanticipated crisis? Another scholar named Paul Quirk came up with this concept of strategic competence. And I talk about this a lot in my presidency class. To perform competently, presidents must have a workable strategy for achieving competence. So I just want to talk about this for a minute, and then we'll open it up for discussion. A president's time, energy, and talent and capacity for direct personal competence are scarce resources. Choices must be made and delegation is necessary. Presidents have to delegate a lot of stuff. Only the most really important stuff actually gets to the president. Depending on the task, they have to trust the judgment and expertise of others for their own to get satisfactory results. What should I delegate and who should I delegate certain tasks to? How do I decide on the people I want to have around me? What skills do I want them to have? What expertise do I want them to bring? How are they going to compensate for what I don't really have? Most of our presidents, for example, are not scientists. So where do they find out about science and technology? Yes, that was important when it came to the COVID crisis, but it also was important when Harry Truman had to make decisions about the atomic bomb. He didn't understand that. He was a high school graduate. He had no more formal education than you have right now, maybe a month more. And yet, he had to find people who could advise him on stuff he really knew nothing about. And every president has to do that. The success of who you hire to compensate for what you don't know, to provide you with the expertise you don't have, will make a real difference in the quality of presidential leadership. Achieving competent performance can be viewed as a problem of allocating resources. What abilities does a president have? What abilities does the president not have? And how do they compensate for that? Presidents are best able to employ strategic competence if they have a clear mastery of the following: policy priorities, what do they want to do, or what do they need to do? Competence and the processes of policymaking. Do they understand how government works? And do they hire people around them who also understand how these things work? Clear processes for decision making within the presidency. How do I take in advice? How do I process that? How do I organize my staff and so on? What kinds of skills do I want my staff to have? Not just in terms of what they know, but in kind of how they interact both with me and with each other. So, what does all this mean as we anticipate the 2024 election or any future election? And does this change how you might think both about the presidency itself and about future presidential candidates as you decide who you might want to vote for, or even who you might not want to vote for? So that's really all I have prepared, and we have about half an hour to talk among ourselves. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully most of you don't have your cameras on. If you do want to speak, you might want to turn your camera on and maybe use the hand raise function and it's under reactions at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a tablet, it may not be on the bottom, but I'm happy to get your sense if you have any questions or if you have any comments. But let's open this up for some of you to say some stuff. Yes, Kenneth.
Hi.
Hi.
I think it's interesting because nowadays, and this might have been a thing like back in history as well, a lot of Americans are voting based on how they feel about a candidate instead of looking into their policy. And it's hard because most Americans don't follow politics and don't follow what's happening in a deeper sense. So all they really see is the candidates on the debate stage yelling at each other, or them,
somebody gives a charismatic
making a
speech,
fool of themselves,
or
what
somebody
the
makes a
news media puts
charismatic
out there.
speech, right? So you're right. And yet a lot of the skills that we really need to find in a president are the things that we can't really see in those kinds of circumstances. So you're absolutely right. And so we need to start saying, okay, this is an important responsibility I have as a voter, and it is an important responsibility. And so my job is not to tell you how to vote. That's not the job of any professor to say, you must vote for this candidate because I think this candidate is better. That's not the point. But to give you the skills to make an intelligent decision and to kind of suggest to you what you need to start looking for. So I think, you're starting to ask the right questions, Ken. I really do. Who else has a comment or a question? Somebody must. I see a hand is up, but I can't see whose hand it is. Oh, excuse me. And I'm going to mispronounce your name. So would you please pronounce your name for me so I get it right?
Hello, I'm Jinzhang Liu.
Jingjiang?
Yes.
Okay, good. Hi.
How does a president's age affect his the decision he make during the unexpected situation?
Well, I think, First of all, we have an unusual situation this year. We have the two oldest people ever to run for president, right? We have President Biden, who is now, about 80, and we have President Trump, who's younger, but only by a couple of years, and he would hit 80 if he is elected in 2024. He would become 80 during his presidency. So they're both not young people. So one of the things then I think that we need to think about is, okay, who else do they have around them? Who do they have as their advisors? Who do they put in their administration? Right? I think age in this case is something of a draw. I think they're both not young people. And yes, the presidency is a very demanding job. But that makes it even more important that we appreciate that a presidency is not just made up of the president, but all of those advisors and all of those people that a president surrounds themselves with. So we need to have a sense of, okay, if this person's elected, what kind of people are they going to surround themselves with that are going to help them with strategic competence and all of that, right? And that's actually true whether a president's young or old, right? So it's an important question, but I don't think that there's that much difference, to be honest, between the two candidates this year. People are saying that age is a problem for President Biden, but really, former President Trump is almost the same age. So I don't think that we can really differentiate that much between them. So Montana, who's Montana?
Hi, what do you think is the best way to mitigate the impact of horse race journalism on the policies of presidential candidates when they eventually get into office?
Did you say horse race journalism?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you don't know what that is, that means that we focus on winning and losing and who's ahead and who's behind rather than on substance, right? And actually, one of the first authorities on that was a guy who used to teach at Syracuse University. He's now at the Harvard Kennedy School, named Thomas Patterson. But it's what we demand of our reporters. We have to demand the kind of substantive information that goes beyond winning and losing, right? And, I think seeking out news sources, and again, this has nothing to do with ideology, but news sources that go beyond the superficial. This guy's ahead, this one's, behind, rather than, well, let's talk about what they're trying to do, what they say they'll do. But then again, also realize the horse race doesn't really tell us, does it, how they will deal with the unexpected. And every modern president's had to do that. So it's partly the kinds of questions that we ask and the kinds of questions that we demand that reporters ask, right? We have a responsibility as citizens not to just be passive recipients of information, but to seek it out, and in some cases, whenever possible, to kind of try to ask questions of people, if not candidates themselves, then of the people who are working in their campaigns. We may be able to get close to those people. We can look on the websites, for example, and read about what do they say they'll do about the environment? What do they say they'll do about taxes? What do they say they'll do about these things? And we can decide, well, this makes more sense to me. Or this person doesn't seem to have a very good plan. And we can make a more knowledgeable decision. So I think that's what we have to do, Montana. I really do. Nicole?
Hi, I was wondering, kind of like on that topic about like researching candidates before the election, and I'll be 18 in June, so I'll find out, so I'll be able to vote in November.
Well, good for
I was
you.
kind of, I was kind of wondering when you think we should like start really researching and like looking into candidates, because I can't really do primaries, but do you think we should
Well, the
wait until
primaries are
before
pretty much
November?
over. We know who the
Yeah,
president is.
exactly.
Well, I think that's a really great question. When should you start? The traditional date was Labor Day, okay? But you're going to be starting college in Labor Day. You're going to have a lot of other things to think about. So my advice to you is start thinking about it now. But here's another point I would make for you and for all of you. And that is, realize that you're not just voting for president when you go in that voting booth. You're going to have members of Congress. Many of you are going to have candidates for the Senate. You're going to have state legislative candidates. Some of you are going to have governorships for election, all these other offices. So you've got a lot to think about, right? And we see how important it is, you know, which party controls the House, which party controls the Senate. Again, I'm not telling you which party you should think is better, but it matters. And so I think the sooner you can start, the better. By the beginning of summer, most of you are going to know who most of the candidates are for office that you're going to be able to vote for. And you're going to be very busy when you get to SU. So I would start thinking sooner rather than later, if you possibly can. Before we go, I noticed there was a question in the Q&A from Nicole, and she asked a really important question. Where is Nicole? There's Nicole's picture on the
Hi,
screen.
I'm up here. Well, I don't know where I am on your screen.
You're not, I don't see your face. I don't think you have your camera on.
I don't, because you don't want to see what I look like right now.
Oh, con. Well, anyway, Nicole asked a really important question, so I'm going to go into that, which is, she's curious about the chief of staff. Is that the second most important influencer in the White House? And the short answer is absolutely. And it's one thing that differentiates the modern presidency from the pre-modern presidency. I assign a book in my modern presidency class called The Gatekeepers, which is actually a book about chiefs of staff from Nixon through Trump. I keep hoping there'll be a revised edition that will get to the Biden administration. But really, the modern chief of staff began with President Nixon. And so it's a relatively new thing. And who a president chooses, what criteria they use, and what responsibilities they give to that chief of staff is absolutely essential. So yes, and here's the interesting thing. A chief of staff, unlike a cabinet member, does not have to be approved by the Senate. They don't go through senatorial confirmation. So a president could basically pick anybody they want, and nobody else has anything to say about it. So one of the questions I would love for, especially when you've got an election, which we don't have this time, about with candidates who haven't been president before, I would say, I would want to ask in a debate setting, what kind of person or who would you pick as your chief of staff and why? Because I think that'd be a
great,
really
yeah.
interesting thing to know.
Thank you so much.
And if you're interested in chiefs of staff, The Gatekeepers is oftentimes my students' favorite book that they read in my modern presidency class. It's by a man named Chris Whipple. I would try to read it. Okay, we've got a question from Lily. Hi, Lily.
Hello, how are you doing tonight?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm great. So I just have a quick question. So regarding the mobilization of students on college campuses to vote, what types of strategies would you recommend for our generation to mobilize strategies to vote? So I'm a transfer student, so I'm currently a freshman at a different school, and so like I know with the election coming up, I haven't seen anyone talking about the election really, so I'm just curious, what would you recommend?
Well, I think college Republicans and college Democrats are two organizations that are obviously going to be around on most college campuses to help you register to vote. You can also register at vote. I think it's vote.com or vote.org. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm registered to vote.
No, but I mean, you can make sure that your friends know that wherever they want to register. Now, one thing you have to decide, most people do not go to college right down the street from where they grew up, right?
Yes.
So you have to decide, do you want to be registered where you grew up in your hometown, or do you want to be registered where you go to school? And you have to decide where you think your vote will have the most impact or where you may care more. You may decide, well, there's a Senate race in my home state, but there's not where I'm going to college. Actually, there is one in New York. So you might say, I'm going to vote at home rather than vote in Syracuse. But these are the kinds of things. We do have actually a very important House race coming up. This is one of the few districts that in 2022, a district that went for Biden in 2020, so it went for Democratic for president, voted for a Republican congressman. And it's considered one of the districts that the Democrats have to win, or really have to try to win, if they want to retake control of the House of Representatives. So there's going to be a big active campaign. So whether you want to keep it Republican or you want to vote for a Democrat, there's some action at that level in the city of Syracuse, but you may decide, well, that doesn't really matter to me. I want to register to vote in my hometown. And check when the voter registration deadlines are for your home state. Check, you know, all of those kinds of things. What are the rules for absentee ballots? When do you have to request them? All of those things. That's a really important question.
Thank you.
Who else? Oh, we got a bunch of things going on in the chat. And Nicole's the only person who asked a question in the Q&A. So let me see what's going on in the chat. The Gatekeeper's book. Oh, good. Somebody put a link to it on Amazon. So who else has a question? We have time for a couple more. Anyone want to ask something or make a comment? Yes, Zach.
Hello. So I was wondering if you could just go in depth, I guess, what role an upcoming election cycle plays in the ability for a president to make decisions.
Well, I would say that if you are Joe Biden, you want to hold on to the Senate, where they have a very narrow Democratic majority, and you'd like for the House to go Democratic. If you're Donald Trump, if you win, you want both the House and the Senate to go Republican. So one of the things you have to do is decide, how can I campaign for myself, but also say things that will also help what they call down ballot candidates to win, right? So that's one thing a presidential candidate has to decide. You know, to what extent is it all about me at the top of the ticket? And to what extent is it about the party? To what extent is it about, you know, putting together an entire government that will work on my behalf? And, you know, you have to decide as a voter too. You know, you may decide, well, I want to vote for this person for president, but I'm not sure I like the candidate of that party for Congress. So I might split my ticket. You can do that, you know. And so it's important that you understand the qualifications of people for each office. Don't assume that just because you like somebody for president that you're going to like everybody running on that party, right? And as I said, Joe Biden carried the Syracuse district, but a Republican got elected to Congress. So people were obviously saying, on this one, yes, on this one, a different yes. Who else has a question, comment? What would you like me to talk about? Because we have about 10 minutes and I want to answer. I want to talk about what you want to hear about, not what I want to talk about. For those of you who are voting for the first time this fall, what matters to you? What kinds of issues matter to you? What are your priorities when you decide who you want to vote for? You may not have really started thinking about that. Somebody had their hand up for about a nanosecond and then took it down. Okay, we got some hands up. Montana, Bobby, and Kenneth, and Lily. Okay, we'll go in that order because that's the order I've got on my screen. Montana, quickly. What matters to you?
I look for the ability to make level-headed decisions, bipartisan decisions.
Okay.
Also, major issue right now, obviously abortion, and that's one of the main issues that I'm concerned with. When I was looking to apply to schools, I looked in states that had abortion laws that were in favor of women's rights to ensure my own safety.
Okay. And you should know then that within walking distance of the Syracuse campus, there is a Planned Parenthood office. Just pointing that out. But yes, okay, so those are issues that are of importance to you. What about you, Kenneth?
I think a major issue that I'm concerned about is our southern border. I think I'm taking into consideration both the incumbent president and the previous president, their policies regarding the southern border, because I think right now it's not looking too good, and with everything that's happened in the past 8 years, that's kind of one of the things that I'm concerned about.
Okay, so that would be something you would want to look into in terms of that, and also in terms of the congressional candidates too, I would imagine, because they're the people who are going to vote on, legislation that might affect that, right? Okay, so let's hear from Lily, and then we'll hear from Zach. And
What
wait a
do you
minute,
think-
we got Bobby too, but I don't see Bobby. We haven't heard from Bobby. Let's hear from Bobby.
For me, I'd say concern, like what Kenneth said, the southern border, but also just internationally with all the conflicts, like Israel and Palestine, as well as Russia and Ukraine. And there's a part of me that's just worried with the way that Russia's been mobilizing, with the amount of support that Ukraine has been losing in the Western Hemisphere, that it's possible that they could infringe on some NATO countries and there could be some all-out possible war.
Okay, so again, a president has a lot to say about international policy, right? And so it's really important that you know where different candidates stand on things like that. So those are and again, a lot of this does depend upon congressional support. So you have to look not just at what a president wants to do, but what legislative candidates want to do as well. And who is this person likely to appoint as Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and so forth. Now we'll go to Lily, and then we'll go to Zach.
So the two issues that I'm most concerned about are number one, the environment and climate change. And number two is abortion. Because like going to college right now, I go to Tulane, which is in Louisiana, and that's a state where the abortion laws are horrible, and it's really sad that there's no access down here. And so like I really hope that like our next president can ensure that, like abortion stays legal in most of the US.
So obviously we've seen that abortion has become a much more important issue since the Dobbs decision on both sides, right? And so I think that clearly we're already seeing. Yesterday, President Biden was in Florida talking about how he wants to prevent restrictions on abortion rights. Donald Trump, on the other hand, is campaigning on the fact that he was responsible for appointing a lot of the justices who voted to overturn Roe. So depending upon where you stand on that issue, you may think one or the other candidate is the best for your position on that issue, right? So this is an important thing, but it also means that you need to think about your state legislative voters, your state legislators, your senators, your governors, and other officials, not just presidents of the United States, right? Because that's not just something that a president controls. Okay, let's hear from Zach.
I think something that I want to hear about and from a candidate is their stance on the economy, because with rising growth in our economy, there's still growth in inflation. And I think that's something that we need to look at from a candidate and what they want to do to, I guess, combat that.
Yeah, actually, inflation is going down, but I don't think everybody is feeling that decrease in inflation in the same way. So I think that is an important issue. What are you going to do about the economy? How are you going to make the impact of certain improvements in the economic situation be felt more across the board, perhaps, than it's being felt right now? So that those are important issues. And again, candidates should be able to give you some idea of what they hope to do. And you can ask, you could demand us from their campaigns. Nicole?
I kind of like going along with that. I am concerned about there's a lot of like housing shortages, and that's why the house prices and the house market's really high. So I wonder how they're gonna achieve that because when I got out of college and like even into my sophomore, junior, and senior year, I want like cheaper housing, of course, and that opportunity to like actually have a home. So I definitely am gonna look at that a little bit more.
Right, and again, keep in mind that's not entirely a decision that's made at the national level. It's often at the local and state level. In Syracuse, for example, rents are going up at a very high and quick rate. And partly that's because there's certain economic development going on. But I'm not sure how much a president has to do with that right now. But it should influence maybe who you'd vote for governor, who you'd vote for mayor, who you'd vote for, you know, for other more state and local offices, right? Well, I think we're getting close to the end. If there's one, maybe two more questions we could do, because we started a little bit late. Anyone else wants to speak? I would be happy to hear from you. If not, I want to thank all of you for coming to this session. I hope it was informative. And I hope to see at least some of you when you get to Syracuse in the fall.
I will second that. Thank you everyone for being here and for all your fantastic questions. I think this has been,
Yes.
despite a lot of people off camera, I know some of you are like at track practice and all these things you've emailed me. So thank you for hanging in there with us. But this is a
Yeah, I
really
really
engaging
appreciate
group.
it.
Yeah, super impressive for all of you to join a professor and have a conversation at this level. I pat myself on the back when I come to these conversations because I feel good that we're recruiting students like yourselves who are
Absolutely. I'm so excited to see that the future of SU looks really bright.
Totally agree. Totally agree. Thank you all for being here. We will have a recording of this class available for you to watch down the road. So just email me if you'd like to rehash any of this. And we hope you meet Professor Thompson and myself when you join us on campus in the fall. Thanks for being here, and we'll talk to you next time.
Take care. Bye-bye.